So my talk today will be about the role of women and youth in the Sudan uprising. And in my presentation, I'll give a brief background into the uprisings that have been going on, and we'll then look at the role that Sudanese women and youth, both in Sudan and in the diaspora, have been playing in the uprising. And then we'll look at the significance of their participation by looking at the broader historical context from which the activism of Sudanese women has emerged. And then we'll look at the role of the youth in rebuilding Sudan. And I'll end with some final remarks. So Sudan's economy has been struggling for several years now, and more recently anger has been rising due to increasing costs of living and other economic hardships, including steep inflation, the removal of food and fuel subsidies, as well as limits on bank withdrawals. As a result, citizens have been struggling to achieve basic necessities such as food, fuel, and cash. Now, the waves of protest which birthed the current uprising started on the 19th of December in 2018 in the city of Atbara and quickly spread to cities across Sudan. The protests quickly turned from demands for urgent economic reforms into demands for the President Omar al-Bashir to step down. The Sudanese people took to the streets to protest, and the security forces responded with a crackdown using tear gas, rubber bullets, and live ammunition to attack the peaceful protesters. The response from the security forces has continued and intensified throughout the protests, and it's pushed the death and injury toll into the hundreds, if not thousands. In following months, protests continued, and on the 6th of April, there was a call to which hundreds and thousands of people responded to march to the armed forces headquarters. And this is an area which is usually of restricted access, and the people managed to enter the grounds and they commenced a sit-in. Following that day and those events, social media and instant messaging access was shut down, and power also was cut in the country. Now, on the 11th of April, Bashir was ousted from presidency, and he was replaced by General Awad ibn Auf, and he would lead the country as the head of the Transitional Military Council. On the following day, so lasting only one day, Ibn Auf announced his resignation following intense protests, and he chose Lieutenant General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan to succeed him. Now, tensions continued to rise, and on the 3rd of June, armed forces entered the armed forces headquarters where people were taking part in the sit-in, and they attacked peaceful protesters using heavy gunfire and burning tents while people were still in them. The Transitional Military Council and Rapid Support Forces, also known as the Janjaweed Militia, attacked the people, and they also entered medical facilities to attack people while they were trying to seek treatment. Furthermore, they dumped the bodies of people who were killed into the River Nile. Now, this attack was carried out during the final day of Ramadan, which is the holy month where Muslims fast from sunrise to sunset. And as Sudan is a predominantly Muslim country, the vast majority of the protesters were fasting and preparing for Eid. Hence, the following day, Eid became a day of mourning and burials as opposed to celebration. It has been reported that in the massacre, 118 people were killed, 70 raped, and hundreds injured. Additionally, 40 bodies which were thrown into the River Nile have been found. Behind me is the name of the 100 martyrs who were identified. So there's more, but these are the ones who've been identified in the Khartoum massacre. Their ages range from 6 to 60, and at least 12 of them were children. Now, it's been difficult to get the actual numbers for the people who have been killed and injured in the massacre and throughout the uprising, because many of them are missing, and the remainder, and so in addition to the bodies being missing, the internet and communication lines have been shut down, and there have been attempts by the Janjaweed militia to disrupt attempts to document the numbers of people being injured and killed. Now, from the 9th to the 11th of June, there was a 3-day general strike and nationwide civil disobedience that was carried out. The Sudanese Professionals Association published estimates confirming the success of this. These include 84 to 99% blocking of flights, 64 to 72% bank closures. Now, the uprising has seen people from different ages, political, ethnic, religious, socioeconomic backgrounds come together and participate in the protests. Women and youth have dominated these protests, and the uprisings are often described as their revolution. So there are overlapping ways in which they've contributed or played a role in the uprisings, and we will look at these now. So both groups have consistently dominated in numbers at the protests. There have been reports of upwards of 2/3 of the protesters being women at some of the protests. They have shown strength in numbers by hundreds of thousands of them coming together to form one voice. And with their huge numbers also comes great diversity. So they're coming together regardless of their differences to work together against their common enemy, the regime, and to work together towards their common goal of achieving a civilian government. Moreover, they're showing solidarity, so they're listening to each other, they're creating spaces for people to have their voices heard, and for many of them, their voices have been suppressed during the regime. So, for example, in conflict areas such as Darfur and the Nuba Mountains, people have been subjected to heinous human rights violations by the Bashir government, and especially the women and children. This has led to the development of chants such as "We Are Darfur," and these chants have continued throughout the protests. Now, in addition to taking part in the protests and having a large presence, the women and youth have also not only participated but led the protests. They've organized, they've mobilized the wider community, and they've also played a part in developing the chants. The chants have been a tool for people to reflect their grievances and to share their demands. And they've also been key in uplifting and energizing protesters across the world. Another key role that they've played is sharing information and raising awareness. So both women in Sudan and the diaspora have been proactive in educating themselves about the situation in Sudan and keeping up to date with developments as they happen. Notably, they've done this with great speed. So, for example, while people were celebrating the ousting of Omar al-Bashir, it was announced that he would be replaced by General Ibn Auf. Now, when that happened, he announced that there would be overnight curfews, that they would be suspending the constitution, but he's also known for the role he played in the human rights violations in Darfur. So the celebrations were cut short and the people of Sudan quickly returned to protest. And so despite the protesters have experienced a number of successes. However, they've remained cognizant about attempts to deflect their attention, to disrupt their momentum, and ingenuine attempts by the armed forces to meet their demands. And they're also aware of the fact that while the face of the regime may be changing, the loyalists and supporters who kept al-Bashir in power for over 30 years still remain in power. Now, the youth have been critical. The youth have been crucial to raising awareness, and they've employed social media as their chosen vehicle. Sharing information about the regime and its development has been done with great speed and consistency. They've done things like sharing tips about how to protect yourself against tear gas, how to stop a gunshot wound. They've also cautioned people about some of the tactics that are being employed by the armed forces, such as looting businesses, mugging people, stopping people in the streets and beating and lashing them as they please. Now, in the diaspora, there are a number of social media accounts which have become go-to sources of information for people who are looking to find out more about the uprising. What they do is deliver information in a way that is easy to access, easy to understand, and they also provide their followers with additional sources which they can look into in order to gain a deeper understanding about what is happening. They also have been clear about the ways in which people can help. So these include attending protests, raising awareness, stressing the importance of sharing confirmed and correct news, signing petitions, writing letters to politicians, and also donating to reputable organizations. This has been particularly important as the national media has been censored and the international media has been restricted from entering Sudan. The Diaspora also holds events such as weekly protests, public lectures, discussion forums, and vigils to raise awareness and show their solidarity with the people in Sudan. It's also been used to share artwork, some of which we have seen, and music created by the people in Sudan and the uprising. By the people in Sudan and the Diaspora. The Diaspora has been key in amplifying the voices of people in Sudan. They're ensuring that their views are heard, their experiences, along with their experiences and demands. For many, this is the only way that their voices are being heard in public due to restrictions on free speech by the regime. So the participation of women in the Sudan uprising has been a hot topic, and it's something that caught the international media's attention several months after the protests had been taken place, and so they started reporting on it quite late compared to when it started. What I'm going to be highlighting is a rich history of Sudanese women involvement in movements. And so what we're seeing today is actually nothing new. Rather, Sudanese women are continuing to assume the roles that they have historically played in their communities and in their country. So the Sudanese women are being referred to as Kandaka, a Nubian word which translates to strong women. It was a title given to queens in the ancient kingdom of Kosh, a region corresponding to modern-day Sudan. The Kandakas ruled over 2,000 years ago. They overlooked the prosperity of Kosh, they built pyramids, and they also led their people into battle. In 1946, before independence, Dr. Khalida Zahir took to the streets to protest against British colonial rule, and she was arrested and flogged. During this time, formal women's organizations began to emerge as the national struggle, led by trade unions, intensified against colonial authorities. Nurses were the first to break through colonial and cultural restrictions on women's participation in public life, and they took to the streets to take part in street demonstrations for the first time in 1948. In 1952, the Sudanese Women's Union was formed with their focus resting on issues relating to health, education, and labor. Later, they widened their focus to look at increasing the participation of women in politics. They've also been key players in the previous protests which have toppled Sudan's dictators in 1964 and 1985. Now, one of the most significant contributions made by the youth to this uprising is what they've done at the sit-ins. So to remind ourselves that the sit-ins commenced on the 6th of April when they gained access to the Armed Forces headquarters, and the march there and then evolved into a sit-in, which lasted several months, and the youth appropriated the space for their own purposes. So we're just going to have a look into like what was happening inside the sit-in. Okay, I will describe it for you. So the sit-in was entirely run by volunteers, and I'll go through some of the things that they provided in the sit-in. So one of them is the provision of basic needs, so free food and water, toiletries, mattresses for everyone. Engineers came together to build temporary toilets, to build drinking fountains, and they even went beyond basic needs to provide things such as air conditioning. The people would come together to regularly clean the area which the sit-in was taking place, as well as the surrounding areas, and maintained how it looked. There's also provision of free medical care, so teams of volunteer doctors, pharmacists, nurses all came together to provide free care, and the majority of those teams were women. There were also education tents which were set up to educate homeless and orphan children. They also invited academics to help them in this effort. The children were provided with free food and drink and activities to entertain them. There was also the arts corner, which became popular. Artists, musicians, and poets as well as political leaders from different parties, visited the area each day to entertain and educate. There were paintings on the wall, they held exhibitions, there were nightly performances, free concerts. So even leisure activities were catered to. So for example, there's a photo which went around on the internet where the protesters stopped what they were doing all to watch the football match. And it was just quite a significant image that emerged at the time. The arts corner is significant for people because they feel that they're finally able to share their ideas and messages which were restricted under the regime. There's also the provision of Wi-Fi and charging points, and they also account for safety with the checkpoints, and they, for example, have stations where they will be announcing the names of children who've been separated from their families in the site. And all these activities continued during the month of Ramadan, where people were fasting, and you would see people coming together to cook food, share food, set up prayer spaces, and then tidy up again at the end of every night throughout the whole month. So the Sudan uprising is not necessarily a political issue, but it's a human one. The Sudanese people have made their demands clear. 1, they would like to see the removal of the previous regime. 2, they would like a civilian government. 3, trials for all the people who were involved in the regime and their human rights violations. And 4, for countries who are financing the regime to stop doing so. The Sudanese people are not asking for aid, and they're not asking for foreign intervention. As we have seen, Sudanese women are continuing to assume the roles that they have historically played in their communities and country. They're effective organizers, they mobilize the community, and they're making their voices heard. What the youth have created at the sit-in is quite remarkable. In transforming the armed forces headquarters into a microcosm of the society that they would like to see, they have demonstrated exceptional organization and cooperation. They've demonstrated altruism, generosity, and unity. They've pooled their knowledge, skills, and resources to build this microcosm. And ultimately, they have proven that they are able to lead, build, and run the Sudan that they're demanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibtehal. You took us actually to Sudan to give us this fascinating account of the multiple roles in the multiple diverse contexts that women and youth play. I like particularly the fact that you talked about not just the leadership and the agency, but also their responses, the historical and contemporary roles in mobilizing people, in being able to provide solutions. And I also like the fact that you talked not merely about knowledge and skills, you talked about the values and really the role of women and the youth in Sudan in terms of adversity is something that we can all learn from. And I think Sudan itself is learning from adapting and moving on. So thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions to that.
So please remember, if we all help and do a little bit, it will make a big difference.